At exactly 7:03 a.m., the sound of helicopters shattered the quiet of my family's 100-year-old farm, and when I stepped onto the porch, I saw armored vehicles rolling across land my grandfather once plowed with a mule. Stay with me, because what started as a 327 HOA dispute somehow escalated into a SWAT operation, and the only reason the truth survived is because I hit record and walked away. This farm has been in my family for 4 generations. Weathered barns, split-rail fences, and fields that still hold the footprints of people long gone. When the suburbs crept closer over the years, an HOA eventually formed near the edge of our land. I opted out. The farm predated them by nearly a century. They didn't like that. It began with letters, complaints about fencing that wasn't theirs, shared access concerns, community aesthetic violations. I ignored them. Then came a notice claiming I owed $327 for maintenance assessments on a gravel road that had existed before the HOA itself. I disputed it formally with documentation from the county. Silence followed. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. The morning the SWAT trucks arrived, I didn't panic. I did something better. I set up my old camera on a fence post, angled toward the main driveway, and started a 15-minute timer. I didn't narrate. I didn't interfere. I just filmed. Because when power overreaches, evidence is the only language it respects. Uniformed officers fanned out, weapons visible. Commands barked across my fields. Neighbors gathered at the property line, phones shaking in their hands. An officer demanded I step forward. I complied calmly, hands visible, asking one question. What is this about? The answer stunned everyone within earshot. They were executing an emergency seizure order requested by the HOA president, citing immediate safety risks and unpaid fines, $327, on a century-old farm. As they moved closer, I told them the camera was rolling and the timer was set. Some officers looked uneasy, others confused. One quietly asked, "An HOA did this?" Yes, and they had no idea what they'd just stepped into. The lead officer paused when I mentioned the camera. He glanced back toward the armored truck, then at the barn behind me, like he was suddenly seeing the place for what it really was instead of what he'd been told. A farm, quiet, lawful, old, nothing about it matched the briefing they'd clearly received. I asked calmly to see the order. He hesitated, then produced paperwork from a folder. It cited an emergency property seizure due to alleged hazardous conditions and delinquent assessments. The requesting party was listed plainly. The HOA president's full name, followed by a phone number. No county official. No court hearing, just her. I pointed out that emergency seizures require immediate danger to life or infrastructure. The officer nodded slowly. He said they were told there were unsafe structures, aggressive animals, and an armed, non-compliant landowner. None of that was true. I had livestock inspections on file, permits for every building, and 0 criminal history. I could see doubt spreading through the line of officers as reality clashed with the narrative. They'd been fed. The timer on the camera ticked down behind us, silent but relentless. One officer broke formation and quietly walked the fence line, noting the posted private property signs in the county survey, markers that clearly placed the HOA boundary hundreds of feet away. Another radioed in to verify jurisdiction. The response came back slower than expected. That's when things shifted. A supervisor arrived. Different posture, different tone. He asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I did, sticking to facts. The letters, the 327, the dispute filed months earlier, the farm's exemption status. I handed him copies I'd kept in a folder by the door. Because when you live long enough under quiet pressure, you learn to be prepared. He read silently. Then he sighed. The radio crackled again. County legal had questions, then concerns, then a very specific one. Why SWAT was deployed for a civil HOA matter. No one answered immediately. The supervisor turned back to me and said something I won't forget. This shouldn't have happened. By now, neighbors were openly filming. The story was already spreading beyond the fence line. The helicopter lifted away, its job suddenly unclear. Officers began lowering their weapons, tension draining from their shoulders. The supervisor made a call I couldn't hear, but I saw his expression change midway through. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "The seizure is being suspended. Effective immediately." The timer on my camera hit 0 right then. I didn't smile. I just kept recording, because I knew this wasn't over yet. It was just changing direction. When the officers began pulling back, the silence felt heavier than the noise that came before it. Engines idled. Radios crackled without urgency. What had been a show of force, moments earlier now looked like a mistake. Everyone was quietly trying to undo. I retrieved the camera, stopped the recording, and made sure the file saved. 15 minutes of unbroken footage. Exactly what I needed. The supervisor stayed behind while the rest of the unit staged down the road. He explained, carefully choosing his words, that the HOA president had reported an imminent threat involving structural collapse and obstruction of emergency access. Those claims triggered a rapid response protocol. No one on the ground had independently verified them before rolling out. That admission alone felt surreal. I asked him a simple question. Did anyone check county records before coming out here? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said internal reviews would follow, and that the incident was being documented as a misuse of emergency reporting. That phrase mattered, more than he probably realized. By mid-morning, the HOA president arrived. She stepped out of her SUV with confidence that evaporated the second she saw the remaining officers and the neighbors filming. She started talking fast, insisting she'd acted in good faith to protect the community. When the supervisor asked her why she escalated a disputed 327 assessment into an emergency seizure request, she froze. She tried to backpedal, claiming the farm was abandoned, unsafe and non-compliant. I calmly walked over to the fence and pointed out the active permits posted on the barn door, the inspection tags on the equipment, and the livestock calmly grazing in full view. Facts don't argue, they just stand there. The supervisor asked her if she understood the consequences of filing a false emergency report. Her face went pale. She said she thought the HOA had authority. That answer landed hard. Authority over landscaping, maybe. Not over armed responses. An officer quietly asked to see my footage. I showed him the time-stamped video from the moment the vehicles arrived. No threats, no resistance, just escalation without cause. He nodded and said it would be forwarded to county legal and internal affairs. By afternoon, the HOA president was asked to leave the property. Not arrested, not yet, but the tone had shifted completely. She was no longer in control of the narrative. Later that day, I received a call from a county attorney requesting a copy of the footage and my documentation. He told me plainly that sending armed units over a civil debt could carry serious consequences if intent or recklessness was proven. That night, as the farm returned to its usual quiet, I uploaded the video privately, backed it up twice, and waited. Because once you expose overreach, it doesn't disappear. It responds. The response came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, my phone started ringing with numbers I didn't recognize. County offices, legal departments, and one reporter who somehow already knew the amount down to the dollar. The video hadn't been public yet, but the incident report had circulated internally, and people were asking the same question over and over. How did a 327 HOA dispute turn into a SWAT deployment? County legal arrived first. 2 attorneys in sensible shoes walking my gravel driveway with notebooks open. They asked to see the footage, the letters, the dispute filing, and the original HOA notices. I laid everything out on the kitchen table. When they reached the part where the emergency report was filed, both of them stopped writing at the same time. One looked up and said, "She signed this personally." That changed everything. They explained that emergency seizure requests bypass normal civil safeguards, but only under strict conditions. False statements, exaggerations, or reckless disregard for the truth could elevate the issue, from civil misconduct to criminal liability, especially when armed officers are deployed, especially when private property is involved, especially when there is no immediate danger. Meanwhile, the HOA board imploded. Emails leaked. Emergency meetings were called. The president resigned for personal reasons before she could be formally removed. Board members released a statement claiming they had no knowledge of her actions. That claim didn't hold up long. Screenshots surfaced showing internal messages where concerns were dismissed and escalation was encouraged. Quiet pressure has a way of leaving fingerprints. The reporter finally showed up in person. He filmed the barns, the fields, the fence line where the vehicles had staged. He asked me why I filmed instead of confronting them. I told him the truth. Confrontation gives power a reason to double down. Documentation takes it away. When the story aired, the reaction was immediate. Calls of support, outrage, people sharing their own HOA horror stories. But the most important response came from the county prosecutor's office. They formally opened an investigation into false emergency, reporting an abuse of process. A week later, the HOA president was charged. Not for the money, not for the fines, for knowingly triggering an emergency response without cause. The penalties were serious: fines, probation, and permanent removal from any position of HOA authority. Standing on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip behind the same fields my great-grandfather once worked, I felt something settle. Not victory, resolution. The farm was safe. The record was clear. and the line between authority and abuse had been drawn in ink, not threats. The final hearing was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but its impact reached far beyond that room. The prosecutor walked through the timeline calmly, showing how a routine HOA dispute had been intentionally reframed as an emergency. The footage played on a screen, uninterrupted, from the moment the vehicles arrived to the moment they pulled away. 15 minutes that told the whole story without commentary. The former HOA president's attorney argued misunderstanding, urgency, and community safety. The judge asked one question that cut through everything. What immediate danger justified armed response? There was no answer that fit the facts. Silence filled the courtroom, heavy and final. The ruling came swiftly. The emergency report was deemed knowingly false. The seizure request was ruled an abuse of process. Penalties were imposed, including probation, fines, mandatory training, and a permanent bar from HOA leadership. More importantly, the county issued new safeguards, requiring independent verification before any civil request could escalate into an armed response. That change mattered. Afterward, reporters asked if I felt vindicated. I told them I felt relieved. Power works best when it's quiet and accountable, not when it's loud and unchecked. Filming wasn't about humiliation. It was about accuracy. The farm returned to its rhythms. Animals fed, fences repaired, crops planted on the same schedule they had followed for generations. Neighbors stopped by, not to gossip, but to say thank you. Some said they'd felt trapped by small authorities for years and didn't know there was a way to push back safely. The video eventually went public. I didn't edit it beyond clarity. No music, no narration, just what happened. It spread anyway. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. People recognized the pattern. I still keep that camera by the door, not because I expect trouble, but because preparedness is a form of peace. The lesson wasn't that HOAs are dangerous. It was that unchecked power anywhere can become reckless. A century-old farm survived droughts, recessions, and expansion. It wasn't going to fall to a $327 invoice and a phone call. Sometimes the strongest response isn't resistance or anger. It's patience, evidence, and a timer counting down while the truth does the work. If there was one thing I learned, it was that systems correct themselves only when someone forces clarity into them. Filming created that clarity. It slowed everything down just enough for reason to catch up with momentum. That 15-minute window became a mirror no one could look away from, reflecting not just one bad decision, but a gap that could have harmed anyone. Closing that gap felt like stewardship, not just of land, but of fairness itself. And that responsibility, once recognized, is something you carry forward quietly, long after cameras are turned off permanently.